Thank you so much for joining us tonight for our third and final conversation for the year. It's very encouraging to see some familiar audience members and great to see some new faces. So welcome, thank you. So our writers block made up of myself, Christa, as well as David and Bárbara. And tonight we have a guest speaker, artist Serge Alain Nitegeka. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're so excited to be in conversation with you. Maybe for the benefit of the newbies, I'll share a little bit about Writers Block and our intention. So the idea is for us to kind of build a community of writers where we can think together, we can write together, we can share our industry ups and downs, our joys, our woes together. And the focus is predominantly on the arts and arts criticism in South Africa, but we're also hoping that as we grow, we kind of can look towards the rest of the continent and potentially other regions in the global south or the majority world. So this is our first season, and we've really kind of zoomed into the visual arts with 3 talks, as well as a concurrent workshop program with selected writers. And in future seasons, you will see that we'll be looking at other arts practices such as music, literature, performing arts, etc. I think it might be important to give a kind of brief recap of our previous conversations so you get an idea of the arc that we've been trying to build in season 1. So our introductory talk was in July, titled A New Art Writing, and this is where we discussed why we write about art and the state of art media in South Africa. And this is with our guest speaker, Rousseaux. And then we had our second talk in September titled Art Fairs in Open Cities. And this allowed us to think about the relationship between artists, writers, and fairs, and how to engage more meaningfully with the city's art scenes. And this is with artist Lawrence Imwana. And this kind of leads us to today's conversation, titled Art and Storytelling. Like I mentioned, it's our final one for the year and for the season. And I guess today we're wanting to think about how stories help us make sense of the world and how they've been used in visual arts. And we'll also be touching on other forms of writing, such as fiction, and how these can be useful in our ongoing conversations around art criticism and its evolution. As always, thank you to the Keys Art Mile and Gallery One team. It's been great to have a home for these conversations and our bi-monthly workshops. And just as a brief mention, we are surrounded by the exhibition Still We Rise, which includes artwork from the Ifaletu and SAPC art collections, so please do stick around to take some time to engage with those books. Now I will read everyone's bio so you get an understanding of who these lovely humans are. Maybe let me start with you, David, because you're right early. So David Mann is a writer, editor, and art critic from Johannesburg who writes at the intersections of art, architecture, performance, and fiction. He is a former editor of the arts publications Between 10 and 5, Creative Field, Q, and the Iraq Journal. He currently works as the writer for the Arts Incubator, the Center for the Less Good Idea. His collection of short fiction about the South African art world once removed was published by Rousseaux Publishing in 2024. It has been awarded the 2024 Thomas Pringle Short Story Prize and shortlisted for an NIHSS Award and Nadine Gordon Award for Best Short Story Collection.
Okay.
The next we have Serge Alain Nitegeka, who was born in Rwanda in 1983 and lives in Johannesburg. In addition to 7 solo exhibitions at Stevenson, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and Amsterdam between 2012 and 2022, Serge has exhibited at Wits Art Museum in 2025, Marion Bosley Gallery and Bosley East in New York between 2014 and 2025, Scan Museum of Art in Savannah, Georgia 2015, and the La Manège Gallery of the French Institute in Dakar in 2012. He's also won a number of awards, including the 2019 Grant Award for the Barnett and Anna Lee Human Foundation, the 2018 Via Extraordinary Award for Sculpture by the Claire and Eduardo Villa Trust, and in 2010 the Tolman Award for Visual Arts. And in the same year was selected for the Dakar Biennale, where he won won the award for Foundation Jean-Paul Larrey Prize. So thank you for joining us. And finally, Bárbara Rousseaux is an Argentine economist, researcher, and writer based in Johannesburg. Throughout her career, Bárbara has worked across disciplines and coordinated cultural projects, human rights initiatives, and worked as an arts journalist. She currently works at the Johannesburg Contemporary Art Foundation as project manager for Latin America and managing editor for the JCAF Journal. Bárbara is also the co-founder of Drift, a literary art agency that represents African authors in Latin America and Spain. The texts on contemporary art, form and politics have been published by Africa as a Country, the Sunday Times, Mail and Guardian, Le Quotidien, Art Drop, and others. So yes, and as I'm Christa, I'm a writer and cultural programmer based here in Joburg.
Okay.
So yes, so housekeeping and humanities out of the way, we can get to the juicy stuff. This first question is kind of directed at each of you. So we see artists and writers working both independently and collaboratively, recognizing the importance of telling the stories of artistic careers, socio-political moments, as well as marking the art world's landscape in real time and in retrospect. So I'm curious about what each of you see as the generative intersections between visual art and storytelling, and how they help us make sense of the world. I don't know who would like to begin.
Is anyone eager? I can kick us off. Hi. Good evening. I guess if you're thinking about the sort of generative, affective power of art, like that encounter with art, be it performance or an art object, there's those kind of surface moments, there's the kind of color, form, those formal qualities of art, and those kind of register in a particular way. And then there's that kind of moment that happens, that kind of Rilke-esque, I must change my life moment, right? Where there's goosebumps or there's a kind of whirlpool in the chest, that kind of sense of engaging with art and kind of walking away changed or edified in some kind of way. And it's my kind of understanding that relies on narrative, that can't just be down to formal qualities alone. That's a kind of story that you're engaging with, or some kind of narrative thread that's emerging through an artwork. It's a kind of, for that to happen, you need to locate yourself or kind of recognize yourself, or just recognize something, be it a kind of protagonist or character, an event, a kind of series of activities that kind of humanize that experience and kind of facilitate that interaction and that engagement. And I think, that's down to storytelling. Art and artists need to be storytellers in order for that to happen. Otherwise, you're kind of really just putting out an object or a performance for unknown reasons, I suppose. When it comes to the reverse, I guess I've been interested for a long time in kind of art and performance as literary devices or kind of tools for storytelling, and very interested in how art can be a protagonist itself, or character, or kind of plot device. And I think on a basic level, I write short stories often, and they are often always about the art world. I'm interested in how art serves as a kind of very useful shorthand. It's this kind of shortcut into an emotion or way of being, or a kind of predicament that I think is very generative and very useful. I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay. I think it's wonderful to see an idea have an existence in the world away from words and text. It's essentially what artists do in whichever medium, whether it's performance and installation, paintings. There's a story behind it that has taken form, that has taken on a performance, has been brought to stage. So the idea of the fact of an idea becoming something solid, I think is beautiful. There's always a narrative behind it, and the condensation or the narrowing down of a big idea or a big story into something small, something concrete. You know, I can come here and bring a bottle of water, and that can stand in for a lot of things. It just needs a few words to bring it to life, and then it ceases to be a bottle of water, it becomes something else. So, yeah, it's cool.
I think the other thing when I think about storytelling in the arts is also about curation and about kind of who is entitled to tell a story in terms of the curatorial work. And I think that's a debate that comes on like so often in the arts around, well, why is this person, you know, why is this person telling this story? And then from that, you know, natural discussions around, I don't know, gender and race and class and age in terms of, you know, who will, I don't know, have a legitimate kind of position to tell a story. So I think in the arts, that's, besides obviously the artist, there's also kind of the curatorial work of storytelling, and with that kind of a point of contention, I think. And last time in our workshop, in one of the workshops with Writer's Block, we were discussing this article, right, about a retrospective by Philip Guston, an American artist, and he was doing all of this work around self-reflective, but also reflective of an era around the Ku Klux Klan and his own identity as a Jewish white man. And the curators were planning to do this retrospective in 2020, and then with Black Lives Matter, they thought, no, this is very risky, this is not a good idea to go forward with this retrospective. And they pulled back. And then eventually in 2022, they did this show. But the choice was like kind of to do all of this kind of safety nets around how the art will be engaged. And I'm just thinking like, what does it mean to mediate art in that way, and how it can kind of damage the potential of a work, in the sense that this article that we were discussing with Writer's Block was kind of posing that work has the capacity to think about whiteness in the US and how complicit the artist is, even if he was also victim of the Ku Klux Klan, like a longer history. But just to say that curatorial work is also so influential in terms of how art reaches to people. And I don't know, I'm just thinking about this like quite crucial point of contention in terms of how the viewers and how audience kind of gets to the art and how is that mediated and what does it mean. But then also around how art can be then an archive for all of this meaning that also changes in time. You know, one work might mean something in the 60s and the 70s, and then what does it mean when we continue to engage? And also allowing for that archive to evolve. Yeah.
Just to quickly add on, Serge mentioned the kind of idea of art giving material form to ideas, and then a kind of distillation of that idea in an object. And it kind of reminded me of the American writer Kurt Vonnegut has these very beautifully simple kind of story arcs that he maps out on an almost mathematical kind of level. It's this y-x axis, like those sine graphs we used to have to do in maths. And he maps out the stories of the world on these things, on a kind of axis of beginning and end, and good fortune, bad fortune. And his argument is essentially that like there are kind of 5 key stories in the world that we know. There's obviously more, but it's if we think of them, they can all be variations of these 5. One of them is a very familiar one because it's like a rom-com story, you know. It's like person meets person and there's this tremendous off-scale happiness, and then something terrible happens, they lose each other, and the arc plummets, and then at the end it's this wonderfully sort of happy ending. And I always like to think about stories in that way. It really is that simple. It's just a line that moves up and down that you can follow very simply. All of that to say that I think done at its best, done very well, art is this kind of distillation. It's this object that holds those kind of stories and those narrative arcs. So it's a bottle of water, but the kind of narrative embedded inside of that work or that sculpture or whatever is a story of piped water from Lesotho, laborers who kind of set up that infrastructure, protagonists at work, good guys, bad guys, all of that stuff. And it's an incredibly hard thing to achieve, I think, but done well, that's art and storytelling at its kind of finest meeting.
Thank you. I think it's quite significant. I mean, you've all kind of touched on this in different ways, but I guess this idea of like the recognition of the self as in, like an individual, but also as a collective and as part of a kind of longer narrative is quite significant in thinking about storytelling, both in art objects and in writing. And we've spoken about this previously, but this idea of like interpretation, which you kind of brought up as well, Bárbara, around curatorial texts and like the kind of devices used to invite audiences in or block them. And I think that's quite significant and something that we can maybe continue to talk about. Serge, you have an incredible career that spanned around 2 decades. And your work has kind of focused on themes related to forced migration, engaging quite deeply with your own lived experience. This exploration kind of took diverse forms in your first institutional show in Joburg, Black Subjects, which was held at the Wits Art Museum recently. I have 2 questions that are kind of connected. Firstly, could you share a bit about the title for the show and how it kind of serves as a preface for the themes explored in the works? And then if you can touch on the kind of significance of exhibiting at WAM and how it connects to your personal history and your conceptual journey as an artist.
So the show came down on Monday. It was fantastic. It was nice to go back to Wits and do a show there. So conceiving the show, there's a lot of, it's a museum show, and there's traditions and conventions that are associated with having a museum show. And I was very adamant that I didn't want to have some sort of survey or retrospective, as it were. I wanted to have a bit of the old, my student life there, and combine that with the trajectory that I'm on, like in my studio life at the moment. And there is a film there that I showed, which so happens to be the title of the show, Black Subjects. I made that film when I was a student, and to this day it still echoes a lot into my installation work and paintings. I use the stills, the subjects in the film in my paintings. It goes that I make sculptures and installations so that I can paint them. It's just a way of continuation. So when it came to the show, the film itself, Black Subjects, became this central work that connected me to Wits from the film that I made to the old work that I used to make and to the point where I am now in my career 20 years later. So the black in itself, in the title, quite simply, first and foremost, talks about my identity as a black man, an African. And further than that, it has taken on the metaphor in terms of paint, to talk about even the concept of black, to talk about the void, the black, the unknown, the uncertainty that is very closely associated with displacement and forced migration. Thus far became this topic this theme. And two arching themes that sort of guided my curatorial, because I did all of that, I was the artist and I was curating. Sometimes there's no line between those two. So from the film itself, I was looking at movement and load. The load, the physical load, and the psychological load that is associated with displacement. So in there we're looking at psychology, we're looking at trauma, and how that is a manifest, and how in making objects, primarily from second-hand found objects, the crates that I use, and also making sculptures that have amended aesthetic, sort of talks about the process of, while in the process of making something that's broken, you are, as the maker, also engaging in a process of fixing yourself, sort of meditative process. So it's like a symbiotic relationship I discovered much later in talking about it. It's like a subconscious thing that finds you, that you find yourself working in a particular way. And when you sit back and look at it, you realize that, that there's a lot that you're working on yourself as much as you're making. So that was a little bit about the psychological load and trauma and all of that. So the works that I had on show were looking at those two themes in my work, spanning over a period of time. And in them, I was also looking at something very central to my sculpture making, the idea that the audience, the viewers, are very much of the mind process. They're part of what gives meaning to the installation. The fact that they are needed as much as required to walk through, to engage with the installation, is part of the completing and part of the collaboration that I invite in my work. I believe that sculpture needs to be, well, at least that I make, and the subject matter that is so universal since the dawn of time. We've been forced to migrate for various reasons, much of which hasn't changed to this day. That I wanted to invite the viewers to participate in that almost self-fulfilling narrative of forced migration that is here to stay, that's here with us, and we need to understand and participate in it. So I didn't want to have a situation whereby I was doing this myself. I wanted merely to create a stage for the viewers to interact with in the museum. So the subject part of the title, subjects, means the viewers, the performers in my film, whoever was in that space was the subject. The idea that you're subject to the space, you're subject to your movement being obstructed, you're subject to being directed, you're subject to not having sort of like a normal experience of the space as a museum. The idea that sometimes when I started working this way, some people will be like, are we supposed to come in? Are we supposed to get in? There was that kind of ambiguity in terms of movement, or even engagement as far as what do we do here? What are we supposed to do? I thought a museum or a gallery was supposed to be when you looked at the work on a wall or walk around a plain thermal sculpture. So the idea that I'm here now to see a show and have to decide whether to engage or not, was quite pivotal. The idea of access, the idea of movement, the idea of the body, which I talk about a lot in my work, both present and absent, occupy spaces that are set up and for the bodies to be subject to whatever is in the space. And that's also the experience, again, talk about uncertainty, unknowns that displaced people are subject to. So the black subjects also refers to the idea of anonymous displaced people. The subjects, the performers I had in the film weren't identifiable in terms of their faces. They were fully covered from head to toe in black. So they were anonymous. And the idea was for the viewer to be able to see themselves in those suits, being anonymous, performing or being in the space. So it came that a few times doing the walkabouts at Wits, sometimes I would get there, someone has gone through and has seen the film, and they would have a deeper understanding of the installation or the whole show. So the film itself, the black subjects, and the idea that the viewers walking through the installation became the black subject as well. There's this idea of the viewers being pivotal as collaborative partners in making the show, making the installation what it is. The idea that function dictates meaning. The idea that, for example, the chairs they were sitting on wouldn't be chairs unless they're being sat on. So it follows that logic, the sculpture you're making. Was there a second question?
You have touched on
Oh,
all of it, but
fantastic.
if you have any final thoughts, please feel free to share.
No, that's it.
Can I say something?
Okay, cool.
I think also in your work, there's this kind of, it feels like it could also happen anywhere. Like it's anonymous, also the settings, these landscapes of these subjects that like kind of jump from the film to the paintings. And it feels like that movement also happens with the subjects that like are jumping from one artwork to the other, and the viewer is just like following this trace. Yeah. And I think that's also interesting for the viewer, like in this, they're also in movement in this landscape that is like, it's very impossible, like it's not impossible to move, but it's just like difficult. It's obstructed. Yeah. And I think that in terms of the storytelling of forced migration, for the viewer that maybe they haven't experienced that firsthand, it's like kind of a bodily response. So it's not explicit in terms of like you're not naming where you are, but like you're inviting viewers, I feel at least when I visited the show, to kind of feel that obstruction or feel that load. And that, as you say, it's physical as it's psychological. And I think that was very effective in terms of how, as a viewer or as the audience, completes that experience. Just wanted to say that.
it's part of that narrative that they have to be part of as well. And so at the time there was construction work, roadworks happening around the museum at the time I was installing. Even to this day there's still stuff happening on Yangsmans and in the court as well. So someone says something about, understand this work better, there's no difference outside and here. Like, I spent 10-15 minutes outside trying to get into WAM, driving around, trying to figure out how not to miss you or walkabout, so, yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. It's incredible to hear you speak about the kind of layering in that exhibition that you thought through both as the artist, the maker of the work, but also the kind of curatorial framing that you kind of mentioned, and how the significance of the work comes to life in that invitation or forced invitation, where the audience has to think about the body, which is so central to your work, and has to think about movement, and has to think about placement and displacement, which I think is really quite significant. But it was also great to hear you get an insight into your relationship with your work. This idea of this, you said, I think it was, you have this symbiotic relationship with your work, where you're able to kind of think through your own story, and this idea of like using the broken or the second hand to make something new, and kind of that reparative work that comes through the making of your work, which is really quite powerful when thinking about storytelling, as for you as an individual artist, but also to the broader conversations around forced migration. I think we can move to you, David, because I'm quite curious about your thinking about fiction as a form of criticism. And you've been thinking about this for a while. You've produced a number of articles that kind of engage with the subject, as well as your book, Once Removed, which is one of the more kind of recent manifestations of this exploration. Can you share a bit about your evolution in your thinking around fiction and its relationship with art writing?
Sure. I guess Once Removed, kind of summary, it's a book of short stories, 13 interlinked short stories about the South African art world. And they are first and foremost short stories, or stories that I'm interested in telling, but sort of seeded in each of them are various questions I had for myself or experiments I was interested in undertaking. Art as a kind of literary device, performance as protagonist, those sorts of things. But I guess, sorry, I've just totally lost my train of thought. Oh, but then also, frustrations I had with the kind of art industry that I had been working in for a long time. So, I mean, the stories kind of hold questions of institutional critique, questions of value, all of these sorts of things we ask ourselves in the art world to begin with. But I guess that experiment, when that investigation was sparked, I guess by two moments. The one was, I was reading a short story by a local writer, Richard Reeve, who I adore. And it was the story about, it's set in Cape Town in an apartment, and it's all these artists and sort of liberal types talking about being kind of activists and people who are politically kind of involved. And they're talking about taking action and doing great things. But all they're doing is smoking weed and sort of just being self-congratulatory. Nothing happens. And it's this really searing critique on that kind of mentality, I think, and how people often hide behind art and industry. It's kind of under the guise of doing great work, but it's all really just puff and language and kind of relentless sentiment. And it was this kind of epiphany for me. I thought, gosh, this is a way to talk about all of these frustrations, ideas, conversations that I have with peers, with artists, with writers about the industry, but that, these questions, comments, reflections perhaps don't have a natural home in a conventional review essay. They wouldn't find a kind of natural platform to be published. But here was a perfect landing place for them inside of a kind of fictional narrative that does what good fiction does, is it kind of reflects the world back to you in smart and sincere and kind of subtle ways, and makes you just see things a little bit differently. And I guess, the other main thing was a frustration with art writing that I was engaging with, my own and the writing of others. It was this kind of, at the time it felt like everything was formulaic, insincere, kind of in service of a market or an industry. And I was bored to tears, and fiction became a wonderful kind of liberatory device and way of working. What are my other thoughts? I guess what I've discovered in this process is that fiction is such a wonderfully collaborative medium and such a playful medium, and it can hold so much. It can do all of these things I've just mentioned, but it's also, it allows for nuance, for kind of airing ideas, thoughts, having conversations, and inviting an audience in, I guess, inviting a readership in to co-author meaning and to kind of arrive at a text or a body of work with their own ideas and their own kind of responses. Writing for me is a wonderfully collaborative act. And what I'm realizing more and more is that good art writing, that is not fiction, that is criticism, ought to actually do all of those things to begin with. We shouldn't have to flee to fiction or kind of hide behind a short story. For me, it's I guess when I started this kind of writing, it was an either-or thing. I sort of, if there were, there's barely any money in criticism. There's even less in short story writing, but. At the time, I thought, this is it. This is what I have to do. I have to only write short stories because this is the work that's meaningful to me. These days, I understand it as a vacillation. Things need to sort of move and kind of be in flux. We need to sort of be more playful with our writing, I think. Embrace the storytelling, the collaborative acts of fiction writing, and that critical, insightful work of art criticism. It's a balance. It's a difficult balance, but it's such a gorgeous point of precarity that I'm so happy to sort of tiptoe along and navigate the day-to-day.
Yeah, I remember last year when you invited Bárbara and I to be in conversation with you about Once Removed as part of your press tour. It's fabulous. And it was so interesting to hear you speak about, I think I was a bit shy and a little bit unsure. I didn't know that you could be that brave about writing, and this idea of thinking about fiction as a possible tool for engaging with these conversations that we've kind of spoken about, the frustrations in the industry. And I think also something that's quite useful about your book and what you've done with thinking about fiction, which we've spoken about previously, is thinking about platforms to be published. And we often assume that it needs to be an MNG or a Sunday Times, and it's kind of opened up thinking around other public publishing opportunities that are really quite critical for enabling this kind of storytelling. A little bit sad to hear that short stories, the cash flow is a little bit low, so damn.
That said, delighted to report that this year I've started getting a weird amount of commissions to write short stories about art. Like people, I guess the convention is to say, hey, I have an exhibition on, can you come and review it? I've had requests where people have said, I've read your short stories, can you come and see my exhibition or watch my performance, and can you write a short story about it? Which is so cool, and it makes me very, very happy. I guess example like Rousseaux, an artist with What If the World. He's bringing out a big monograph with Skira, and he wanted that whole sort of artist trajectory. he had a curatorial text, he had a academic sort of smart-minded text, and then he said, what's kind of missing is my origin story about my relationship to Johannesburg. Can you write something? And I said, he said, can you write a short story about that's kind of like loosely based around my practice? And I said, absolutely. Heads up, it's going to be really weird to read yourself as a character in a short story, and I think he was a bit kind of thrown by it, but those kind of experiments are so fun. I did another one with Opa Sibeko, the performance artist. So it's and I'm not just saying this to sort of talk about how excited I am about my own work. I guess I'm acknowledging what I'm seeing, which is a kind of shift and an opening up, I guess, in people's ideas about what's possible for how we engage with art and reflect on it, and how we can kind of stretch and grow writing.
I just want to speak about something you remind me of in my varsity days, art school days, is that we tended to talk a lot more than we made. Those sessions of, rise and wine in the studio, and we would jump from topic to topic, and then after hours you realize, like, how did we get here? What are we talking about again? How did we get here? But it would be like later you realize, like, but we solved all the problems of the world, and only to start again tomorrow, but the same thing. They were fun. But what they did is, what I realized, and now with my show at Wits, at WAM, is I did a few walkabouts, quite a lot actually, if I may admit that, is that I'm not a fan of doing walkabouts to begin with, but I did the first one, and I realized things about my work and about things in my head that I really haven't tried out. And what gave me momentum to do the next was to improve on the first one. And I got into a rhythm of, like a comedian, a stand-up comedian, writing out material and going out into the world and trying it out, and then see how it bounces off the audience and how it sounds in my head. And I'll go back home like, oh, that was shit. I need to improve that. This can be better, right? So that fuel me for the next one, and then I will work it out, and then, and I'll get better, and more stuff will come out. And I found that from that process of talking about my work and walkabouts, is that the works that I talked about the most were works that I made almost in my student years, or there's a span of 10, 15 years. So this work has gone out into the world and lived, and has made people, and has been written about, and has lived and changed and come back, and I have changed as well. So I would have a conversation with this work, and in the process of throwing the material out again, I'll talk about it, and I'll go back later, I was like, I wasn't convinced, or like, that was some good stuff, I talked about it, so then I'll develop more and talk about it. So in the end, it was again this collaboration and kind of this symbiotic relationship to work that I discovered from just putting out this material, and almost like back at art school, shitting my way through a crit, for example. It was more or less like I came nothing, and then from things that I've made, I'm brought it to life. So yeah, there's a bit of that from what you spoke earlier that remind me of that. Yeah.
I think also you both touched on like this level of experimentation, and I like, David, what you said around like it's not either or, because if not, things get very like essentialized. Like now it's only fiction because you can't drop names and real art critic, and it's like, it's nice to be like, okay, but what does this fiction generate, and can I kind of, not replicate that, but generate that through like non-fiction writing? I like that idea. And also, Serge, what you're saying in terms of experimenting, in terms of how you speak about a work, and like, yeah, in terms of like bouncing off people as well. I really like that.
Thanks everyone for your thoughts. And hopefully, Serge, we can also hear a little bit about the wine and braai casual chats after this. That sounds really fascinating. Maybe to continue this thread of thinking about different writing genres, Bárbara. So you founded the literary agency Drift, which operates between Buenos Aires and Joburg. And just as kind of a reminder, you kind of represent African authors in Latin America and Spain. Could you give a little bit of background to the agency? And then following that, maybe talk a bit about how your encounters with the authors and the genres that they write in has kind of helped you make sense of being a newbie in South Africa when you first arrived, and also fed into your thinking around creative practices and art writing as well.
Yeah, so in 2019, a former colleague of mine, her name is Julia Boneto, we used to work at a magazine, a feminist magazine in Argentina. She came to visit, it was like, I've been in SA for a year then. She came to visit and I just introduced her to a few people, and then we went to a lot of like bookshops. It wasn't like the typical, South African, no safari, nothing of that tourist stereotypical. We just went to like bookshops and galleries and stuff like that. And then we were just chatting, and she was like, wouldn't it be amazing to have some of these books that side? And I was like, yeah, sure. Like, how? Like, yeah, it would be epic, but like, how? And then, she went back to Argentina. She's a script writer. She teaches in university. And then we started thinking about, what if we start a publisher and like just publish South African authors in Spanish. Just for context, like Buenos Aires is one of the cities, I don't know if this stats is still relevant, but at some point it was the city with more bookshops per capita in the world. I don't know, maybe it's like no old info, but at some point it was like that. So it's just like, it has like this huge kind of literary tradition, but it's very like self-reflective in the sense of there's like people read Latin American authors in Spanish, except a few translators that like translated books that are mainly like brought to Argentina through like these big, like massive publishing houses. So we just started brainstorming, and then it became the reality that like, okay, for a publisher you need quite a bit of money, and it's like that's not happening. So we developed this idea of having an agency that like, I don't know, allowed us to be much more flexible. And she would stay there in Buenos Aires and I would be here. So then we started with 2 authors, and we decided to keep it like very small, kind of boutique in a way, because it's like, look, we can only do so much, it being like a side project. We're not going to open like a massive, like an over-promise things to writers and then not deliver anything. So it was like, okay, let's start with 2, and just coincidentally, we decided on 2 authors that are from Cape Town. Habiba Baderoun, that's like an amazing poet. She actually stays in the US, but she's from Cape Town. Poet and academic, and then Mia Arden, that is like on the other side of the spectrum in terms of like when we signed her, she just had 1 novel, but that novel, we loved her. We loved what she did there. It's called Mermaid Filet, and it's like kind of a sci-fi fiction novel. And I think for me, it was very interesting to kind of learn about Cape Town through their work, through their fiction work, through their non-fiction work. And I think for me, before, I just experienced like a type of tension in Cape Town that I couldn't quite understand or describe. And through their work, I really understood like kind of this historical kind of baggage. And I think, especially through Habiba, she has a book called Regarding Muslims that just like traces the whole kind of history of Muslims in South Africa, but particularly in Cape Town. And she speaks about this kind of trivialization of these legacies, and I don't know, it just like, it really clicked for me and then influenced my own research and stuff. But beyond that, it was really, really lovely to start a process with these authors in terms of like translation. And we work with a Mexican translator. And for example, for Mia, we did a whole glossary from Caps, like Afrikaans, and Quechua to Spanish. And I was also learning, like, I don't speak Afrikaans or Caps or anything, but it was like, okay, how do we kind of pitch this novel that is not only in English, because it's like, it has all of these terms that she very intentionally didn't put a glossary for. So it's like, okay, how do we bridge to someone in Mexico that is like luckily they know like the English, and now it's like you're throwing Caps words. So it's like, okay, how do we work to do this bridge? And that was a really interesting kind of part of it. And also it's like with Julia, we were very like involved in the translation. Like it was about like 4-hour Zoom calls and like me explaining. It was like very like context driven. And then this year we translated one of Khalila's poetry books titled 100 Silences. And it's like this very beautiful, was one of her first books from the early 2000s. Very beautiful kind of vignettes, quite autobiographical in terms of like her grief and her pain, but also like how she sees beauty, very like sensitive. And that was like really beautiful, but I think for me it was also the first time that I was working really collaboratively, like in terms of like working with a poet and working with a translator. And like, I don't know, I've never, like it was my first time that I felt like, wow, this is really like flat, there's no hierarchy. Like, yes, in theory, you're always like, oh yeah, collaborative, but it's like, no. Like this was like, oh wow, this is possible. And being truly inspired by someone that I'm working with, I don't know, it was like really magic, I think, for me. So, yeah, in that way, thank you.
Amazing, thanks Barbara. I think it's also really great because, I mean, I guess what we're trying to do with Writer's Block as well is this idea of like building community and places for connection. And it's great that Drift, in a way, kind of does that, even through these acts of translation, like you describing these very intense Zoom calls, taking the time to really read the author's books and think about how can we be the bridge here, and working really intimately with someone's work as well as someone who's an expert at language. So it's really interesting to see how Drift is also kind of making those like kind of intimate connections and possibilities for community and thinking about writing and storytelling. So that's really great to hear. I think now I'll return to you, Serge, and maybe return to the WAM show as well, because it's obviously the most recent. Maybe we can think a little bit about the large-scale piece, Structural Response 5. And for those who haven't seen it, it's kind of made up of these painted black beams, and they were kind of erected throughout WAM's main space. So this work kind of has a story of its own as an art piece, in that it's kind of its first shown, I think, in 2011 at the National Arts Festival. But there's also been other versions that have been installed in other locations since. And maybe to return to your thought around experimentation and your work kind of living in the world and then coming back. Could you share a little bit about working iteratively and how this helps you make sense of the stories that you try to articulate?
It allows me to look at the same problem or the same subject matter anew, afresh, all the time. Because I'm not the same person I was last year. Hopefully I've grown. So that's always the hope, right? Mentally, physically, all of that. So I'm not the same person. So it allows me to look at the work anew, build upon it, and take the language further and push it. So with the first one in Grahamstown, we're looking at and the other ones that have followed it all the way up to, except with the exception of this one, all of them have just existed. The installation, the black beams you described, have just existed by themselves. They've never existed within the context of other works that they have created before. I'm talking about smaller sculptures, paintings, a video, all in the same space. That energy moving across in different spaces and different experiences. So that was the first time, and I like to experiment. That's what drives. And so in each space, it went from Grahamstown. The next one I did was in Dakar, and the next one I did was at SCAD in Savannah, and the next one I did was in Novel Foundation in Cape Town, and then now at WAM. And they all just, the running theme here was that it just gets bigger and bigger, and the ambition gets bigger. The one at SCAD was quite narrow, maybe 4 meters wide, but the length was the length of a football field. So it was quite long, it was daunting. And then I came to Novel Foundation. The atrium was huge. I was using planks that are 8 meters high, and like 560 of those pieces. And so each iteration had different approaches to space, the demand on my physical body, on the execution, the time constraints, all of that fed into it. From sourcing the wood to making the space work, to spending the time there. My process of working is quite different in each space, and I deal with different, should I say, collaborative influences. Some of it is abstracting, in the sense of an institution that would want certain parameters around the passage where people can walk quite freely, so 2 meters high, 2 meters wide type of thing. And I would have to think about how to work around that and still have the integrity of the work still. So that is always a challenge. No space is the same, no space has the same sort of conditions and rules and regulations. And working around those regulations and rules, I see them as obstacles, opportunities, to allow the work to change, to adapt, to sort of, in a conceptual way, assimilate to the space. Again, another theme around identity and assimilation and displacement. So, setting myself up, I set the work up in myself, the way of working that informs, or the mindset of, that you would associate with displacement, bringing that into the way I make work, flexibility, adaptability, all of that. So the approach and the opportunity that the sculptures themselves, the way of making presents, it's the same, slight variations, but with a lived and sort of grown personality and identity. So it's something I'll grow with. There was times where I was thought like, this will be my last, because it feels like I'm doing the same thing. But that was like 3 installations ago. So it's, and now this one came down, and then I've started planning on the next one. Yeah, so this one is gonna be big, even more ambitious than the other one. So what does that say about my practice as an artist, myself, and my work, where it's going. So it's taking on that. So I factor pressure and physical exertion to make work. I make most of this work myself, and on a few occasions I have someone helping me. And there's a beauty in knowing how something is made, of having made it yourself. There is an imbuing of the artist energy into the work. And at the very beginning I was talking about an idea, a set of words taking shape, becoming an object. So the beauty is in the making, is in the process. And in my work I talk a lot about the in-between space, the liminal space between home, the old home and the new home, while you're fleeing, the crossing of borders, the change of identity, and how that informs how you see yourself, how you deal with the world, and the things you make, which inevitably not only heal you, but talk about your state of mind or state of existence. So there's quite a lot about the process itself is quite revealing, and the process is sculpture making. I make sculptures and installations so that I can make paintings. I love to paint, but primarily it starts with the installation, the physicality, the body that I keep going back to. And it's in the body, that physical exertion, that I put myself into. So there is a sense of danger with the viewers. Can we walk in here? Is this thing gonna collapse? Who made this? Is the engineer sign off on this? There have been cases where be like, leave him alone, he's been doing this for a long time. It's never fallen, he's got a good track record, blah, blah, blah. So there is that. So that works in my favor. But there's always those questions that linger around in terms of when a work is made and what that evokes out of the viewer. And that is putting myself into that state of mind to put my body through that, to see how I respond. For example, I think out of the 5 installations that I've done, structural responses, the most difficult that on my body was the one in Cape Town. It was like 3 weeks working 12 hours a day, even on weekends. So it's that kind of physical exertion, and I loved it. It makes sense. It's sort of like my path, and if it's not hard, I don't do it, or I don't deserve it. It's like sort of like it's like a mindset. Back again to talking about trauma. What does that mean in the context of that? Does it mean that I choose suffering to prepare for the unchosen suffering? What does that say about trauma? Is it a counter trauma? Is it a way of preparedness? Is it a ready mindset that the body and the mind are one and they're ready to take on whatever? Is that the approach to site-specific way of working, which is how I set up my installations? The idea that you find and use space and use order in the space to make a work. So there's quite a bit, and let me stop there. I can talk for quite a while about this. Yeah. Is it cool?
That's fabulous. Thank you for sharing. It's always incredible to see an artwork have multiple lives. And as you kind of mentioned, over these kind of 5 iterations, this develop a kind of personality and identity as an artwork. And also thinking about your different approaches to space and how the work has to, again, kind of be a representation of the themes that you're thinking about. The work migrates, your work thinks about migration, thinking about the body, thinking about exertion, and having to navigate space as an artwork whilst you're thinking about navigating space as a physical body. So that was really quite powerful to hear. Thank you for sharing that. I think as a kind of final question, which I will share with all of you, please feel free to take it in whatever direction you like. So in our previous conversations, we kind of spoke about the over-intellectualization of art writing and the need to think more imaginatively and intently around art criticism. So how do each of you think other forms of writing can assist us in the kind of undoing and reviewing of the language that we use to talk about art? What do you think those other genres offer us as artists, as writers, as art viewers?
I've spoken a lot about my belief in fiction as a kind of great generator towards that. But perhaps it's also just about tone and style and how the kind of attentiveness to those things as writers and as readers. I'm busy making my way through Nicola Brand's new photo book, which is gorgeous, a massive book about her own sort of German Namibian heritage and ancestry. So it's a heavy book. It deals with kind of legacies of genocide and settlement and kind of land grabs and all of this very heavy, complicated, urgent subject matter. And it's edited by Alexandra Dodd, the art critic, very well, because there's a series of essays in that book and they're kind of neighbored very well. They're set alongside each other very nicely. In that the first essay I read was by a writer who's engaging the whole book and the body of work were really with kind of two images as points of departure, a pair of donkeys in the desert and then a cluster of unmarked roadside graves. And the writer reflects on their journey through that part of Namibia, and it becomes a very kind of intimate, handheld guide through the photo book, which I just adored. The very next one kind of just jumps in with facts, history, death tally, dates, and the stuff that kind of I just shut off when I engage with it immediately. I just think, God, Jesus, spare me, because it's too much of dry information. But at the same time, we need those things. We need a record. We need a kind of account of history. And I just really appreciated the pairing of those essays because we need both, and I needed as a reader to move between the two. I needed the story to kind of give me a human understanding of what I'm looking at, but then I also needed to understand on a kind of factual level what it is I'm looking at and the kind of, the realities embedded in that. So I think as writers it's our duty to kind of straddle that or kind of tiptoe along that line. Let's write in engaging ways, let's tell stories, let's make a text inviting and interesting, but also let's always be mindful that there must be a record and we need to sort of be responsible about communicating that record. And then I guess as another observation, I've been interested lately in the kinds of short form content we're seeing more and more of in the form of reels or TikToks where this has happened globally, and then as it does, it kind of seeps into South Africa. But it's people who are walking through exhibitions or art fairs and giving us very kind of vloggy, cute tours of these things. And as you can probably tell, I'm not a huge fan. But it's not because I'm a Luddite or a kind of purist, because nothing is being said. If you pay attention to these things, they are not saying anything new. They're kind of regurgitating press releases or popular opinion. One I watched, I think just this morning, was hey, I'm visiting this show, a lot's been said about it, and proceeded to just rehash what the gallery had written about it, which is like, what are you doing? What is the point of this? It's just PR. And this was an independent, what do you call, content curator. They weren't, wasn't a sponsored post. And it's concerning to me how we've adopted and embodied in very kind of natural ways the language of the art market. And we've abandoned a kind of care for how we write about things and how we tell stories. Because what happens when we do that is you're kind of just, you're not resisting a kind of dominant discourse at all, you're reinforcing it, and you're not edifying an audience, you're not inviting an audience in, like it sort of was mentioned earlier, to co-author meaning or to kind of be unsettled or moved in some kind of way. But undeniably there's a reach, and it's a form that is kind of hugely successful at the moment, and I'm interested in how we can borrow from that as writers. Yeah, that's it.
I seem quite old when I keep going back to bits, but you frame this all the time, so I'll blame you for this. In my first year, I had the pleasure of watching a conversation between Marlene Dumas and Eugène Siopis. They were in the theater, and the way it was set up was, I don't know, was brilliant, was amazing. And it seemed they were having a conversation between the two of them. And every student that was there was just eavesdropping. They were so engaged and talking about stuff as if they were sitting in a sitting room and talking about stuff. And it was nothing heavy, it was just painting and what it means to them and whatever. But it was so beautiful and engaging. And I think part of that kind of conversations is needed. We need to, as artists, if you have a show, like authors, let me call you that, there's a book out, you do a tour, right? You're promoting the book. But it's not a promotion I'm pointing to. I'm pointing to the fact that there's more work that's needed. Something is not made, and then for the moment it's out there, I think it needs a voice still. Not to validate it, but just to give it more. With work, with artwork, we see the things. We see the same thing differently, and in the same way we think about it differently. We write about it differently. There's a lot of dialogue that can be exchanged, and in that exchange, there is a lot of. There's a lot to be gained. There's a lot to be gained, and. Since doing all the walkabouts that I've done, I realized that it's very important in thinking about the work. Because each time I went home, I took some notes. I was writing all the time and thinking about the work. And my struggle always is with which words to use. There's so many ways I can express myself. With art, I can be precise. And this is what I'm saying, and it's quite safe in the sense of, it's yellow paint. That's it. It's not a paragraph. I can write 10 paragraphs over that, but on this surface, it's just yellow paint. So there's a lot to benefit from having conversations and. Allowing the audience or the public to talk about, and having different sessions, open studios, where you invite one or two people, to come in and talk shit. It's important in terms of how you think about the work and how you write about it, and how that is shared with the world. At the end of the day, you're making meaning and you're generating meaning. And it's not the final product. I think it's in the process of trying to extract that. It's quite exciting, and the business is so exciting. So
I think the other thing when I was hearing you guys speak is also like the other materials that the artist, let's say, got influenced by. It could be poetry, it could be film. I often like try to understand that when I also write, even if my response to the work is not a poem or a film. Like, I don't know, an example is Shirin Neshat, like often references kind of Persian poetry, and then this is like famous Iranian poet Farrokhzad. And I was like, when I was thinking about her work, it's like, well, let me read this actual poems, and then I feel like I can engage to like a much like deeper level with the actual work, even if like literally she's not like speaking about that necessarily, but like part of her practice is influenced or inspired, or a certain type of like aesthetic form speaks about that. And the same with other artists. I don't know, I think it was last year or the year before, I wrote about Zineb Sedira, and she was deeply influenced about film in Algeria in the 1960s, 1970s. So I was like, okay, let me watch these films, even if I'm not gonna like literally write them, but it feels like then the way that I go back to the work is like, so I'm so changed by these things that the artist saw, and I kind of see things that maybe are like not so obvious. So perhaps my reflection is like to kind of allow oneself to access this kind of collage of influences that the artist has also been affected by in like the most positive way, to then kind of re-engage and go back and forth with that. Yeah, I just want to say that.
Thank you guys. I think now it's time for the audience to shine. I might also throw the last question at you guys, what you think other forms of writing can offer us in terms of thinking about how we talk about art. But does anybody have any questions or comments? Don't be shy.
Yes, please. Thank you, Bárbara.
Thank you. My question is actually for Bárbara. For Drift, why South Africa? Why did you decide to base your agency here? And do you have limitations to the number or the kinds of languages that you translate or represent?
At the beginning, we wanted to do like the whole continent, but then we realized it was like insanely ambitious. Like we're only two, and I live here in Joburg. Like the whole continent, no, it's not possible. So like we decided to just start where I stay, that is in Joburg, and that's how we said, okay, this is the first step. And then in terms of languages, it's Spanish and Portuguese, because we only cover Latin America and Spain. The moment we don't do Portugal, I guess that ideologically it's mainly Latin America in terms of building that bridge, but then the reality is that the biggest literary markets are of Latin America, in Argentina and Mexico, and then often the same books also make it to the Spanish market. So we were like, why shy away from that? So that was our rationale. But in an ideal world, we would continue to expand to other authors, and a lot of authors actually reach out with their manuscripts. But the reality is that because, and I think with the Writers Blog we often speak about that, because we have 9 to 5 jobs, both myself and Julia, she's a scriptwriter and a lecturer at the University of Film in Buenos Aires, we don't have so much capacity. So we were like, let's do a very like small agency and focus all of our energy in these 2 authors. And once we actually achieved like real stuff, then take on more. And it felt more like reasonable and manageable for us. But for example, we managed for Habiba to go to Chile, and then she did like this incredible residency even in Harvard. So obviously we also like apply for them and try to get them fellowships and residencies and stuff. But as I say, we only have like, I don't know, time after work and like during the weekend. So that's also like the rationale of like capacity-wise, I think, yeah.
I think everyone's feeling a bit shy. We will still be around. Oh, yes. Do you mind passing the mic? There we go.
Hello. My question is, especially because we've spoken a lot about writing practices and storytelling, I'm curious about the other side of this pipeline in terms of what are your reading practices? Because I find that, I also write, and sometimes it happens quite selfishly that you produce and you kind of have this expectation that, echoes in someone's world in some way, but then you're not quite reading other creators as such. So I'm just wondering, in terms of people with specific outputs, what are your reading practices?
That's a really great question, thank you so much. So of course there's, art criticism. So reading publications here, please buy the physical copies if you can, even though the newspapers are getting thinner and thinner. And also reading artist books, because often we are the ones kind of commissioned to write those texts, and it's incredible to learn about an artist's practice through text, alongside documentation of their work and their exhibitions. One of my favorite books and favorite authors, Serge Alain Nitegeka. I read that book at least once a year. And it's an incredible way of engaging or thinking about city life and urban living. And it's also great to see a book that talks about the realities of Joburg in a kind of fictional form. So yes, very much looking at the typical arts writing platforms, but also a lot of people's Substacks. People who started Substacks where they're producing relatively more independent writing and putting their thoughts together, and it's great to see people playing and creating space for themselves to share their thoughts. So that's been really, really exciting for me. Yeah.
Yeah, I think to echo you, I read almost quite stubbornly local work. I read my peers quite actively, and I have a long list of mentors, and official and unofficial people who don't know that they're my mentors. I read them all the time. Lauren Bukes, you've unlocked a memory for me. Moxieland, the Cape Town novel, was an early encounter for me of local art being put to work inside of a narrative that was dropped in a really subtle way. There's like a dramatic kind of climactic moment at an exhibition opening, but it does such great work to kind of set the scene. So yeah, shout out Lauren Bukes. But reading is multifaceted like writing, and it's kind of constant and ever present. So I'm kind of always reading. I'm reading things quite critically, exhibition texts, and fellow writers and things like that. But I'm also reading when I'm scrolling mindlessly on TikTok. I consider that a form of reading. Even all of that insufferable nonsense, that kind of utter crap, it's valuable because it reveals things to me and what I don't like and what I'm kind of quite harsh about. There's a reason that I have such a strong reaction to these things, and it tells me more about myself, I think. Yeah.
I don't read. I buy books. I've been buying books for years now, but they're all brand new. Some I have never opened. At the moment, I'm reading this. That's it.
Yeah, I feel that also like sometimes, like at work, I read so much about arts and about artists that I need like detox. And sometimes my detox is like really crap content to like just put my mind in like blank. And then when I achieve the detox, then I can like emerge to the world. But that being said, I'm on a reading club. It's virtual, anyone can join. And it's organized by a friend. Cindy Lee, my bride, and I mention her like every single time. It was like I'm obsessed, but she's my friend. And yeah, anyone can join. And it's wonderful because it's things that at the moment, every single time it's been things that I've never read, and maybe I would have never read, like chosen. So I like that possibility of saying like, okay, I would have never like, you know, encountered this author or this book, but now I want to, and I want to see what other people just like think about it as well, and motivated to like step up as well. So that's been quite nice. Even if I'm exhausted and I need to like, you know, blank, I still do that, and that's been like a really good tool, I think. And beyond that, yeah, I read like Atrium, contemporary, and I must say that the writer's block workshops that we do with the cohort, it's been also nice because we like research, like for each session, we research and propose to the writers a few texts depending on the theme, and that's been really cool. Like David and Christa suggested texts that I was like, I love them, and like I don't know, there was one around why every press release is written in a code, and I found it so revealing that I even shared it like with a lot of friends, and a lot of friends were very inspired, and I was like, this is so cool. So I think it's quite simple. It's just like people being open to other people referencing or like recommending stuff, and that has worked really nicely for me in general. Oh, Karen.
Is it okay? Good evening, and thank you for hosting this talk tonight. My question is for Dave Mann. So Dave, this year I've been grappling with entryways into dealing with institutional critique, and because since I was a kid I've known that tact is one thing I lack when trying to communicate how I really feel about things. And I think satire and fiction has really helped me in this space. So there's a project I'm working on called the Dreamcatcher Office of Care, where I've created this fictional space, and there's a lot of absurdity, but there's a lot of like pointing back at the lived experience. It almost serves as a kind of need. Like if you sit in front of the work, there's a lived experience that you had, whether at ShopRite or at the department of whatever, trying to get paperwork or whatever. And I wanted to ask you, as someone who uses fictional writing in your short stories as a way of expressing the different frustrations you have with institutions, I'd like to know what your frustrations and almost limitations might be when using fiction as a vehicle. Because when I think about fiction, I start thinking about opacity, Toussaint's opacity, and how that becomes a kind of weapon or a place to run to when trying to move through spaces that can be politically charged without having to identify and arrive as something that might be used against you. But in that, there's a lot of possibility, but I find myself getting lost in possibility. And for me, that then becomes my challenge. So I'd really like to know how you navigate honoring your frustration, but also living in the refuge of critique. Thank you.
Thanks, Bárbara. The joys outweigh the frustrations, I think, with the fiction. Frustrations being fiction is not, I guess, as an experiment I'm undertaking and many others have before me, it's still, fiction as criticism, I mean, is still not a kind of validated form, I guess, in this world, in this industry. It's not taken as seriously, I think, as criticism or critique. And that can kind of feel a bit hopeless when you're in the act of kind of crafting those narratives. point of entry joy is just that it's such a catharsis to write this kind of rant and air these frustrations and these predicaments in your own mind on the page. And then this really beautiful thing happens kind of halfway through the story, because you're dealing with characters and you're dealing with predicaments or kind of actions and antagonists. Unless you're writing a very boring story, something happens that needs to be worked around or figured out. And in that act of figuring that out as the author and as the reader as well, when you're engaging a story like this, there's a very kind of human activity that takes place, which is a kind of empathizing or kind of understanding that this character that I thought I was writing and I thought I kind of hated, a kind of art world, a cultural worker, I kind of hate that term. There's this cultural worker that you're just trying to write this like vicious story about. But they need to be layered and interesting and nuanced, and you sort of, in doing that kind of writing, they become more human to you, and you realize, okay, there's a reason that this person is kind of making these decisions and these choices, and that's such a productive, generative kind of space for me. It helps me make sense of the art world in such a productive way. I've forgotten the other parts of your question.
The challenge of honoring the critique with this like big landscape of like fiction.
Honoring the critique. I'm not sure if I have a solid answer for you right now. There's the trap of being vague with fiction, I suppose. So yes, I fully get that question, and it's a question I ask myself all the time. It's like, am I just writing some... Because I also like writing really weird short stories that kind of dip into surrealist moments. And then it's sort of like, what is this in service of, actually? Am I writing some kind of veiled ramble or rant? But I guess the beautiful thing about writing stories or producing any kind of art is that you have your experiment or your project and you put it out into the world, and then you have to sort of leave it. And the work meets the audience or the world halfway, and they need to sort of pick it up from there and make new meaning out of it. And I guess that's the risky part, where you just have to trust that in that connection, in that meeting, is where that critique is coming through in a meaningful way or a kind of productive way. And that it's not your project alone. You're not this kind of authority on anything. There's a whole audience that adds their meaning and their value and kind of everything that they bring to the story. Yeah.
I think also, Dave, in your stories, what happened is that as a reader, you're constantly trying to be, who is Dave? Who is this gallery, this one or that one? And you're like obsessing, and maybe the joy is that the critique is not, I think the success of it is perhaps that you're critiquing like maybe a bit more, not to say that it's generic things, but perhaps it's not about X or Y gallery, but it's something that constitutes certain archetypes of people or of personalities or spaces or dynamics, and then people can be stressing and like doing theories around who this person, but I think, as you say, that's where the audience comes in and completes the story with real life characters, and they can make their own critique, and perhaps it's not what you're necessarily saying, but that's, I think, the beauty.
I am a little bit concerned about time. I think if there are any last questions, maybe we can have them in conversation informally. So thank you everybody for joining us. It's been delightful. We also have a YouTube channel now, guys.
Yes, we do.
Yay! So if you missed our previous conversations, please write us a blog. What do they say? Like, subscribe, comment, whatever. Engage. Please engage. So if you missed our previous conversations, please go on there. The first two are there, and this one will be uploaded soon as well. Thanks to Open Window Institute and the students for being superstars and helping us realize that. And yes, thanks again, and please stick around for a chat, some wine, and some water if you're really thirsty. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.